50 minutes at a time, and then take a 10-minute break, just like we were in a college class.
Great.
And then the last 30 minutes would be a little walkabout. It's not too chilly. Okay, so good morning, everybody. This is quite the amazing turnout for such a cold, wintry day. I'm so thankful that y'all are here, and I'm thankful to be here as well. Teaching is a great honor. A little bit on my background. I went to Texas A&M University back in the late 80s. Got a degree in forestry sciences, and then went and served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Guatemala. I did agroforestry in the highlands of Guatemala. It was a great Peace Corps assignment. You know, some of the things about it, I mean, it was really one of the best Peace Corps assignments you could get. We were in the mountains, so there was really no risk of dengue and malaria. And I worked with the indigenous communities there, and they were very kind and generous. And you go further east in Guatemala, it gets a little bit more like the Wild Wild West here in the States 150 years ago or so. But there were a few things in the Peace Corps that didn't make sense, like just as you're getting to know your community and know the language, oh, your time's up, it's time to go back home. And then in the Peace Corps, they break you up into narrow disciplines. So I was the agroforestry person, and then there was the community health person, and the small animals, small livestock person, and the ecological wildlife restoration people. And so they broke us up into narrow disciplines. And after working with Bill Mollison, who was one of the founders of Permaculture Design, and Alan Savory, who was the founder of Holistic Management, they brought all these disciplines together in a more holistic perspective. So you're doing everything that you can on one side. And the Peace Corps literally separated you so that you weren't hanging out speaking English with your fellow Peace Corps volunteers. So they literally geographically divided us up, and they divided us up by our disciplines. So when I ran into permaculture design, I was on my way back. I'd been working on crab fishing boats in the Bering Sea, which is like being in prison with the possibility of drowning. And well, I was working as a marine biologist, as an observer, so we're monitoring what they're catching so that they don't overfish that resource, which it was well overfished, 30 years before. And each one of those fishing boats was like a small floating city. I mean, I can't imagine how much energy they were spending to keep those boats out there. But I was on my way back from the Bering Sea to Texas, and I ran into this architect, Bill Rowley, and I had heard of permaculture design from Patricia Michael, formerly known as Patricia Dubois, who had spoken at an Earth Day event in Austin. And so Bill Rowley gave me the permaculture design manual and some Pacifica radio interviews of Bill Mollison. And then lo and behold, when I got to Houston, Bill Mollison was coming to Fossil Rim Wildlife Center in Glen Rose, Texas, to teach a permaculture design class. And I took out a credit card just so I could put the money on the credit card to take a class. And Fossil Rim Wildlife Center is a 10,000-acre wildlife refuge for endangered species. Now, not all of the animals there are endangered, but my oldest daughter was born there, literally with scimitar horned oryx and llamas and ostriches in our backyard. And we learned a lot there. And of course, the adventure of life is half the time you're learning what not to do. So looking at Fossil Rim, and the oak wilt had just decimated all their live oak trees and was hitting the red oak trees pretty hard. And the grazing there was relentless. And that's also when I met Alan Savory, who came up with the concept of holistic management. Savory was a wildlife biologist. He was working in Rhodesia for the government in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And they actually went out and massacred a bunch of wildlife, including thousands of elephants, to make way for settlers. And so after they got rid of all this wildlife, the landscape began to deteriorate. And he realized that, when you talk about a savanna or a prairie, like we have savannas and prairies here in Texas, you really can't differentiate between the wildlife and the plants and the soils and the geography. Like, they're all one thing, bound all together. And so when you think of Texas, like, what's really missing? Well, it's the bison that are missing in Texas. And so it was a real honor to work with Bill Mollison, Alan Savory, and then I moved to Elgin, Texas. Been living there now for 26 years, longer than I've lived anywhere in my life. and began teaching permaculture design classes with Dick Pierce and the Austin Permaculture Guild. Taylor Monroe and Caroline Riley taught with them for years. We hosted several permablitzes, which were 2-day volunteer events where we did earthworks like soil and water conservation. We did perennial food gardens. We amended soils. And a lot of those methods are going to be what we're talking about at the back half of this presentation today. So we're going to start with a broad view and then narrow our way down to carbon gardening. And I'd like to hear from y'all, and normally when we have more time, I'd have all of you guys introduce yourselves. So feel free to chime in, let me know who you are, what you're interested in, what you're hoping to get out of this presentation, and I'd be happy to modify the presentation to answer any of your questions. So one of Alan Savory's biggest bones to pick with people like me is that we get focused on certain tools. And so let's just talk generally real quick about holistic. Whoa, Chris. And so in holistic management, it used to be called holistic resource management, but everybody thought he was talking about holistic range management. And he really had a much broader approach to managing systems, so they got rid of the R, and now they're Holistic Management International. And so you want to come up with a holistic goal, and I would say that our objective for this presentation is carbon gardening, also known as carbon farming. We'll talk about carbon gardening because it's on a smaller scale. And today I'll be presenting a lot of tools, but you always want to be circling back to what is your objective. For instance, if we're carbon gardening and part of that process is shipping in truckloads of mulch year after year after year, and your objective is to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but you're paying an 18-wheeler to drop off 12 or 20 yards of mulch on your site, well, that's a lot of carbon that you have to sequester to make up for that mulch and the fuel that delivered that mulch. But I completely understand that to get systems up and running, there's an initial investment. But as Alan Savory would say, we don't want to get too focused on one particular tool, which I've totally been guilty of during my life because I'm in construction. Okay, so that's the other thing I forgot to mention. That since living and working at Fossil Rim Wildlife Center for 3 years, I ended up in construction. Thought I would end up in landscaping, tried it for a while, but back in the day before sustainability and all this stuff was more popular, if you were in conventional landscaping, it was like the antithesis of what I wanted to be doing. Lots of pruning, lots of chemicals, lots of tilling, lots of unnecessary irrigation, and plants that really aren't meant for this climate. So instead of ending up in landscaping, I got into construction, and I've been doing natural building for 20 plus years, which includes straw bale houses, adobe block houses, cob houses, earth bag houses, and just generally like adhering to principles of passive solar cooling and heating. You hear a lot about passive solar heating, which got popular with Michael Reynolds and the Earthship community in New Mexico, because they live in a cold, arid climate, so they're trying to trap heat. But here in Texas, quite often, we're trying to shed heat and buffer our homes from the heat. And that's going to be part of the equation that we bring into this when we look at the carbon accounting of the whole site. And so let's focus on sustainable design systems now. So permaculture is a design system. And what it stands for is permanent agriculture. And Bill Mollison grew up in Tasmania. He did lots of things. He was a hunter and a trapper and a fisherman, and ultimately ended up being a university professor. And so he was out studying natural ecosystems and nature and just marveling at how all of these systems were running themselves without any human intervention or inputs. And he thought, by golly, if nature can do this all by itself, then maybe we can just figure out what it is that nature's trying to do and give these natural systems a nudge and kick them off so that they can begin to run on their own. And I believe in Kenya, there was a Nobel Prize winner, an African man, and all he did to kick off reforestation was fence off certain areas. And he just let the native trees drop their seeds in these protected areas. and began to reforest vast regions. All he had to do was fence it off from livestock from eating whatever it was that was coming up. Another hero of mine is Wangari Maathai. She also got a Nobel Peace Prize, and she was attempting to reforest the Sahel, which is the shelter belt of trees to the south of the Sahara Desert. And so one thing we have to realize here in this latitude of Texas, this is 30 degrees latitude. We're at the same latitude as Baghdad in Iraq. So the 30 degree north and 30 degrees south, those are the true hyper-arid desert belts of the planet. So here we sit literally either encouraging the desert to come in and encroach, and they call that desertification, or trying to hold the desert at bay. And fortunately, we're close enough to the Gulf Coast where a lot of our moisture comes in from the Gulf. But the further west you get, the more arid it gets really quickly. So permaculture is a design system founded by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren back in the mid-70s. And what makes it a system is that it has a set of ethics, principles, and methods. And Mollison kept this pretty simple. And if you think of any professional society like engineers, doctors, lawyers, they all have a set of ethics or canons that they try to adhere to. And again, these are tools for helping us to process information. And, we were talking about the Bible and wisdom, and we get lured by wealth and status and power. And in our culture these days, it's very easy, just everything's driven by financial needs or financial gain, logistical needs or like power, transportation, water. And we can get off track really easily. And it happens over and over in the Bible. A lot of brokenness in the Bible. But if we have a set of ethics, principles, and methods, then those help to make our decisions. And so the first ethic of permaculture design is care of the earth. And so everything we do, it's like Alan Savory saying, go back to your objective. So if what we're doing, we're trying to sequester carbon, let's say, but are we actually harming the environment in that attempt to achieve that objective? So care of the earth, care of all species is the second ethic.
Even fire ants?
You gotta wonder about this. Well, they're not native. My coworker, we're at a job site, and he sees a fire ant mound next to the sidewalk, and he kicks it, and then he starts stepping on the ants. And I'm like, Tony, you don't have to do that. Like, you're not going to make a dent in that ant population. And I think what happens is a lot of plant species and insects and animal species that we find to be annoying or even destructive are coming in on the wake of our disturbance. So a lot of the invasive plants are from China because we share a lot of the same bioregions that China does. And so in the back of these subdivisions all over Houston, you have the Chinese tallow tree and the China berry tree, and I guess the fire ants came in on the banana boats 100 plus years ago. And I think as we advance the natural succession of these ecosystems, that those invasive species kind of drop out, like they don't have the same niche that they always had. So when we get closer and closer to a subclimax or climax ecosystem, those conditions don't exist, which are so conducive to fire ants. But yes, mosquito. Well, I saw the Dalai Lama interviewed, and the interviewer is like, well, would you even swat that mosquito on your arm? He's like, oh no, why would I do that? Yeah. Now, I do get these kissing bugs in my house, also known as assassin bugs, and I will trap them and end their life. Yeah. They bite you at night, and they carry Chagas disease, and it's almost as bad as bed bugs. So care of the earth, care of all species, including human beings. Now, one of the things I realized, so I got my start caring about nature. We were tubing and kayaking on the Guadalupe River, for 8 or 10 years. Every summer, we'd go to the Guadalupe River, and I really fell in love with the natural world. And then I took a 2 courses with the National Outdoor Leadership School, where you're immersed in wilderness for 30 days at a time. But as I got older, what I realized, maybe not what the problem is so much as what is the solution, is helping to help human beings meet their needs sustainably. So what's driving all this is us taking what we need from natural ecosystems. And believe me, living in the country, I really don't live in Elgin. I live out in the middle of nowhere. And they are taking our water, they're taking the lignite coal, San Antonio especially. And so the greater our demand is for water and electricity, the more harm we do to the broader landscape around us. And so, for me, falling in love with the natural world and bending over backwards to save, well, for instance, in the Peace Corps, we were always working where nobody saw what we were doing. Like, we're way back in the mountains. And then I'd pull into a town, and just the whole first mile or two of approaching that town was nothing but erosion and degraded landscapes. And I was like, we really need to be doing this work where everybody can see it and benefit from it. But the trick is helping people live sustainably. And I had just about given up. Like, I was pretty sure the best thing we could do for the environment was just to curl up under a tree and go away. My mother really thought I was going to kill myself. She was very concerned. And then at my permaculture design course, Bill Mollison is like, no, Cabby, we can do it better. We can give back more to the planet than we take from it. And by do it better, he meant, so the technical definition of permaculture is the conscious design, creation, and maintenance of an agriculturally productive ecosystem that has the diversity, stability, and resilience of a natural ecosystem. So we're trying to mimic natural ecosystems, but insert what we call analogs, similar plants that provide food and shelter for human beings. And we're going to talk a little bit more about ecosystems as we narrow down. So care of the earth, care of all species, and return of surplus to the system that created it. And one example, have y'all heard of Lundgren family farms? They were a big rice operation that converted over to organic farming. This is 20 or 30 years ago. And Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote The One Straw Revolution, he comes from Japan to consult with Lundberg family farms, and they always had on their box of rice, outstanding in their field, they're out there in their field. And a lot of crops, we used to just burn the crop residue. So we would just burn it. Why? Well, to get it out of the way and to break the pest cycles. So crop residue is what's left over after you harvest the rice. So it's the leaf and the stubble. And so they would burn that. So instead of, and that's a surplus. That's left over after you've harvested and you've made your income off of that. And so Fukuoka comes over and they designed a press. It was basically tires full of concrete, spaced a certain distance apart. I think it ended up being about 16 or 20 feet wide. And they would press the crop stubble into the soil. They would return that surplus into the system that created it. Now you got to remember, like, farmers don't make a lot of money, so surplus comes after you've paid yourself a living wage and made a reasonable profit. And anybody know who Adam Smith was? He was an Englishman who came up with the concept of capitalism and finance. And he said a reasonable profit is 6 to 10% profit. Now what happened during the mortgage derivative crisis? We were up there at 30% profits, which basically meant it was a Ponzi scheme. And that system collapsed. Now I have to wonder about Bitcoin. Who's into Bitcoin these days? A lot of my friends are. All my libertarian friends are into Bitcoin. And they're the same guys who are into nuclear energy, which I'm really not into nuclear energy either. So once something gets so profitable that you start to get dubious of, like, is this really a sustainable system? And there's a great movie called The Botany of Desire, and they talk about the Amsterdam tulip explosion, and some of these tulips were going for like the cost of a home, and then that market just completely collapsed. However, 6 to 10% profit is reasonable profit. So ethics, care of the earth, care of all species, return of surplus to the system that created it. Principles, you want to get the biggest bang for your buck. And this is basically an energy efficiency equation. So if you're going to expend a certain amount of money or a certain amount of effort, you want to make sure that that system is going to have a yield that hopefully pays for itself over time. And so permaculture stands for permanent agriculture. It relies a lot on perennial food plants, which survive year after year. And this is one way to sequester more carbon. And lignin stores carbon, and so basically there's the gas in the atmosphere. And when we talk about carbon sequestration, we're really talking about the gas, carbon dioxide, one carbon molecule and two oxygen molecules. And trees breathe this gas in, and during the processes of photosynthesis, they separate the O2 from the carbon molecule. And then trees exhale oxygen and store carbon. Now, trees also exhale CO2, and this earth exhales CO2. And mulch piles are exhaling CO2. So CO2 is everywhere. It's being given off by everything. Does anyone remember the Biosphere 2 experiments that were happening in Arizona? This was like 15 or 20 years ago. And they built a glass dome and tried to cut off the interior environment from the exterior environment. Well, they had just poured a bunch of concrete, and they had trucked in a lot of tree mulch. And so the concrete, the fresh concrete that had just been poured like a few months earlier, began absorbing oxygen, and the piles of mulch began giving off CO2. And so the breathable air in there began to just dwindle, and they had to bail on that project after fudging their data for a little while. So carbon is everywhere, it's being given off by everything. But so permanent agriculture, relying on perennial food plants as much as we can. Now, you can't get everything out of perennial food plants, and we're going to talk about that a little bit down the line. Big span for your buck, multiple functions. I'll use the symbol for function. We'll divide this up. So in permaculture design, another definition for it that Mollison really liked was that it's the science of assembling beneficial relationships. And saying we're going to plant perennial food plants, well, there you go, kind of being tool-centric, which Alan Savory warns us about. But everything, if it's next to another element, every element benefits the element around it. And so I like to use the example of your rooftop. So the roof keeps the weather off your head. I like metal roofs. You can get the standing seam metal roof, and they can easily clamp solar panels to it. So you put solar panels on the rooftop, that's a second function. And then you can hook up a rainwater collection system. That's a third function. So everything in the built environment, in the human landscape, should have multiple functions. And then the last principle is redundancy. And so if you've got a rainwater collection system, that's fantastic. I've got rainwater. But if you also have a municipal water tap, I think that's great too. And if you have a well, that's great too. Even you may use 90% of your water may be from your rainwater collection system. But there may be times when you need your well water or you need your municipal water. So redundancy. And those are the principles of permaculture design. The methods we're not going to go into so much, but basically sector analysis, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we're going to look at, say, an urban lot, which is typically 60 by 100 or 60 by 200. Where does the sun rise? Where does the sun set? Where does the summer breeze come from? Where is the winter breeze coming from? Where do I have shade? Where am I overly exposed to the sun? How is the water draining off that site? And if it has a slope, which direction is that slope facing? That's called aspect. How much of that area is what the city might call impervious structure, concrete, rooftops, and how much is pervious structure. Another method of design is zones of use. So I'll write this down, sector analysis. Zones of use is just focusing your energy where it's going to be the best spent. So if you have something that requires a lot of your time and effort, you would do that close to your home, and that would be zone 1. Mollison always liked to think if you had a culinary herb garden, it should be right outside your kitchen door. Or if you like to grow baby greens for your salads, it might be between where you park your car and the front door, so that walking in every afternoon you could harvest your greens as you go in. Or if you have a compost pile that's coming out of your kitchen from kitchen food scraps, that's also close to the kitchen door. Just focusing your efforts where they're going to be best spent. And then the last design system I want to mention, and we'll just go through this, is the Regrarians Platform. Go through it quickly. And this is based on P.A. Yeoman's scale of permanence. And Percival Yeoman was a mining engineer in Australia. And the number one thing they had to deal with was shedding water around their mining operations. And so instead of creating gullies and canals that drain the water away, he figured out ways to store the water on the ridges of the landscape and protecting the gullies from erosion, storing water on the ridges. But what he came up with, oh, that's Chris moving.
It's me.
That back leg needs to stand up a little more, the front legs need to come down. I can make it work. Yeah, next when I get off of it. So we use Google Earth Pro a lot. It's a free program that you can download. It gives you satellite imagery. And when we select an order for all of the data, when we're managing a property, we use the Yeoman scale of permanence. And it basically starts from the most permanent, things that we can't change. Reminds me of that prayer, the Desiderata. Except to change things that we can't change, to the least permanent. And so that would be climate, geography, water, access, forestry, which I also include gardens in, buildings, fencing, soils, economy, and energy. So if you've got an urban lot, I recommend you go into Google Earth Pro. It's free. They update it very regularly. Ours just got updated in November of 2023. Of course, I live in the country. I've got 32 acres. And then underneath, you create a file in Google Earth Pro that, I use street addresses. And then I create folders underneath there. Maybe not every single one, but certainly access. I put the property lines there, the roads there, energy. I'll indicate where the power poles are, where the power lines are, and fencing and buildings, which the buildings will show up on Google Earth Pro. So a lot of this first stuff are things that nature has decided for us. And then as you come down here, these are things that humans can get involved with. Interesting, the soil's down here too, as if, I guess, P.A. Yeomans was thinking we can push the dirt around with bulldozers and amend it, So between permaculture design, the Regrarians Platform, now Darren Doherty revised P.A. Yeoman's scale of permanence, and he's from Australia as well. And he gave a great lecture series or class, Regrarians Platform, a couple of years ago. A lot of us took it here in Texas and benefited from it. But this can apply to your homestead as well. So permaculture design, holistic management, Regrarians Platform, these are design systems that help us to process all the information that's coming in and make wise decisions. We talked a little bit about climate. Let's just talk here for just a minute. So here we are at 30 degrees latitude. We are on the true hyper-arid desert belt of the planet, 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south. What's our elevation here in Austin? 700. Mine's 500. 500 to all the way up to 1,200 feet if you go to Mount Vanell or somewhere like that. So in Texas, you basically have the coastal plains, and then it steps up at the Balcones Escarpment. And to the north and east, we have the Great Eastern Forest. And then there's one more step up to the Great Plains, which is the Caprock Escarpment, which is where Lubbock and Amarillo are. And Texas is a pretty harsh environment. The further west you go, the thinner the woodlands get. So you start on the Gulf Coast, you're kind of starting with almost 100% tree coverage. And then you get into the central prairies, and maybe that's 60% trees, 40% grassland. And then by the time you get out to Lubbock and Amarillo, you're really in a savanna where you have lone oaks, trees standing individually. And so when we talk about permaculture being an agriculturally productive ecosystem, we need to be aware of the ecosystems that are naturally occurring here. And yes, sir?
I don't know, I want to slow you down.
No.
But we've lost the bison, and I'm thinking about keystone species.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what we've seen for the past 150 years and how it's changed.
It has changed so much. And that's our very next segue. So we're going like this. Design systems, site accounting, then we'll touch on carbon gardening. This is better, Chris.
Just good luck.
Yeah, I got his back. Then we're going to talk about permaculture. I'm going to abbreviate permaculture, capital P, little c, tools. All right, so let's move on to site accounting. This is carbon accounting, site accounting. So let's talk about one of my favorite books. It's called The Explorer's Texas. The author is Del Winter, and his book is based on all pre-1865 first-hand accounts of what the explorers saw when they first came to Texas. So this goes all the way back to the late 1500s and early 1600s. See, the Spanish came up through Mexico. They were traveling up the Sierra Madre Mountains, and they hit the Balcones Escarpment, which is we know as the hill country, and it was full of Comanche. And they couldn't get into the hill country, so they skirted it. And so, San Antonio, San Marcos, all the way up to San Saba is all the original Spanish missions. And they noted like the beautiful cedar trees that just mantled is the word they used, the hill country. Now there were people in Austin, city council, 30 years ago, telling us that the cedar tree was not native. And I get it, the cedar tree can be pesky. It's definitely, if you've got cedar fever, it's a nuisance to a lot of people. However, if you want to get into ecological restoration, you're competing with that cedar tree. Like, nothing can really do it better or for less money than the juniper trees. Cedar, they're all in the cypress family, but really they're junipers. So Del Winter, he says that before 1865, 6 to 7 feet of biomass across the entire state had been lost due to overhunting, logging, burning, tilling, and erosion. And so that's where we're starting.
The arrival of the Europeans.
The arrival of the Europeans who had lost their way. And, one of the first things we did was eradicate the bison.
What was their percentage again?
It was 6 to 7 feet of biomass. So all the big trees, all the megafauna, all the organic matter in the soil, just gone. I mean, the first people to get in the hill country were the cedar choppers. And they cut down all the cedar and all the cypress, and they made shingles and charcoal out of it. Now those watersheds are so denuded that we can't get 400-year-old cypress trees because the floods keep knocking them out every 50 or 80 years. Okay, let's take a break and come back at a little bit after 1.
Let's hear it.
10-minute break, just like we're back in college. Congratulations.
Not here. That's a good idea.